way things are done around here in the NHS has evolved over 100 plus years, including the way in which clinicians learn and the way in which they're taught.
The operating model is the how. The strategy, the plan, the target is what we need to deliver.
Perhaps, John, you would share with us, when we talk about an operating model, what does that mean for you?
I think operating model is quite often overused, and it means different things to different people. To me, it means...
Today's guests are John Deverell and Andrew Liles. John is a non-executive director at Hampshire Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust and chair of the board at Exhalation Technology. Andrew is a partner at Concilium Partners, visiting professor at Royal Holloway and a former NHS chief executive. Together, they bring deep practical experience in healthcare leadership and operating model design.
We work with organisations and the teams are all caught up in day-to-day operational work. I think that's a symptom of an organisation where people don't believe in an operating model.
Why do you think now might be a time when people are considering what their operating model is if you were an NHS trust leader?
So we want to get beyond the post-COVID recovery era when the NHS
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this webinar. This is in the first of a series of webinars we're going to be having exploring operating model design in healthcare. So thank you for joining us. We'll have a chance for some questions and discussion in the latter part of the webinar. So thank you very much for joining us. My name's Alastair Mitchell-Baker. I'm one of the directors of Tricordant. First half of my career, I did indeed work in the NHS in a number of trusts. I was also a non-executive director for many years and have been consulting and working with a variety of NHS organisations over many years, particularly in the areas of organisation design, development, leadership and strategy. So I'm delighted today to be joined by two of our guests, John Deverell. John is these days a non-executive director of an NHS trust and has indeed just done a night shift. And you could perhaps tell us a bit more about that in a minute, John. But in his previous career, John was an officer in the army, an engineer, worked in informatics, consulting, and led a large part of a global medtech organisation. So it's great to have John with us. We're also joined by Andrew Liles. Andrew is an ex-NHS General Manager, Chief Executive of Acute Trust for 10 years, and these days works as a consultant, including alongside Tricordant, and is still a visiting professor at the Royal Holloway. So it's great to have John and Andrew join us. Good morning or good afternoon. So perhaps just to kick off, perhaps, John, you would share with us, given your background and you come to it, when we talk about an operating model, what does that mean for you?
Hello, everybody. I think, like many terms, perhaps mostly where management consultants get involved, my dear friend, operating model is quite often overused, and it means different things to different people. To me, it means, and the way in which I use the term, the definition of an organization in order to accomplish its mission, I suppose. And within that, I would include all the factors of production. I suppose there's the real operating model, which is a description of the organization that you happen to have, which is not, in fact, it's traditionally almost not the same as the one which you design. So it can end up being a bit arid and theoretical. But in reality, if you're super clear what it is you're in business to do, whether that's healthcare or anything else, and you can figure out what the strategy is, what the processes are necessary to deliver that strategy, the underlying organization, the network of people, and everything's a people business, and technology and culture, that you put all that together, that you are sure will deliver that objective, that is an operating model. And I have worked with things, although not always using that vocabulary, I suppose, theoretically in the military, when you sort of task organize to do something, but certainly not just in the NHS, but in healthcare and in some other bits of the public sector as well, which I can talk about if you like.
Andrew, what would you add to that?
I wouldn't take anything away, and I guess my experience is all NHS compared to John's. So I do think of an operating model as being how an organisation, and I guess mostly I think about provider operating models, although any organisation can have an operating model, but how you organize yourselves to deliver what you need to deliver as, let's say, as a provider. How are you organized? How do you organize yourselves to deliver? I suppose that's delivering over a range of time frames. So how are you organized to deliver each day from 1 year to the next, and over the long term and the medium term? That's why having a clear strategy is an important part of an operating model. And as with Tricordant, I've worked on a number of operating models with some big organizations. We help people understand why they're in this workshop or why we're talking to them, that the operating model is the how. The strategy, the plan, the target is what we need to deliver. What we want to focus on today or in this process with you is how are you organized? How are you organized to deliver that? And the operating model needs to, in time, work from top to bottom. I think there's been a lot of focus on boards and executive teams, but the big part, I think, of an operating model in our experience is how organizations below the executive are organized to deliver their clinical services. So we get into what is the devolved structure? What's the structure in terms of divisions, care groups, directorates, sometimes across a number of hospitals? What's the leadership model? How does the triumvirate work? Who's in the triumvirate? Who reports to who? What's the culture for how you're organized to deliver, including, importantly, behaviors and relationships through both horizontally and diagonally in day-to-day organization. And I think also, very importantly, how accountability flows through the organization and where decisions are able to be taken. So governance can fall into this, the relationships between corporate departments and local teams. All of these things are elements that you design and seek to operate in your organizational design. So I like to think of it as how we deliver what we want and need to do over a number of time frames, and it being able to work from the top to the bottom of the organization, but a real focus on that, in my experience, on that devolved tier, the divisions, the directorates, the care groups, the whatever they're called in the organization.
So I think we've kind of got a bit of a consensus. It's the kind of how we do things around here. It includes, but is much more than structures. But I'd be interested if anyone on the call have got a divergent view. Do drop it into chat and we can perhaps come back to and pick it up. So, I mean, I guess an interesting question is how often you actually meet organizations that have a consistent, clear operating model that they've been running for long enough that it's actually embedded. And I guess if I think of organizations I've come across, I think probably the Army is getting closer to that than other organizations I've come to. And in particular, having a very explicit leadership system about how leaders are identified, trained, what they're expected to do, and how they're supported in doing it. So for an operating model really to be embedded, you need to be following it through for a fair bit of time. So, John, do you just want to, I mean, as somebody who's worked across a number of industries, do you spot that difference in how operating models have developed?
You mean differences between the industries?
Yeah, whether I'm right in my assumption that actually the Army did pretty well in getting it embedded.
Clearly, the Army is, and I'm not a military expert anymore. I left about 25 years ago or so. But the Army has a number of operating models depending on the situation, and that's the thing. It's designed to be flexible. So the soldier who's marching up and down in front of Buckingham Palace, which is actually it's called public duties, might be that's a particular thing in a way. But the same soldier might, in 6 months or a year's time, be in the back of an armored vehicle somewhere in the Middle East, or he might be on patrol in the jungle, or he might be doing all sorts of things, And then what I think the military, and not just the British Army, but it's the military organisation I happen to be most familiar with, is spectacularly good at doing, I think, is adapting itself, really consciously task organising. Because if you think about the military, you've got the engineers, the artillery, you've got the infantry, you've got the army, you've got the helicopters, blah, blah, blah. And you don't use all of them all the time, but you do task organize with a flexible structure where everybody's practiced to sort of meet the situation at the time. And if you think about what's happening in Ukraine at the minute, which is a different kind of asynchronous warfare in a way, but where you've got drones, the advent of the drone the British Army is adapting pretty cleverly to like a redefinition of what is required where the environment has changed. And so that adaptability, the need to be able to adapt to a rapidly changing situation is present in the armed forces pretty much everywhere, I think. And the ones who are more successful are the ones who are more adaptable, really, unless they're only doing one thing like defending something, probably, whereupon they get very used to defending something until the technology changes. What I observe, though, is that it's organisations which are not change ready, and I would say most of the NHS is a little bit like that from my experience, find it much harder to adapt because the way things are done around here. The way things are done around here in the NHS has evolved over 100 plus years, kind of thing. And so including the way in which clinicians learn and the way in which they're taught and the existence of operating divisions and the way in which referral pathways happen, it's kind of defined. There's lots of stuff which is so evolved and so practiced over decades, it's really difficult to build that adaptability in, as well as, of course, all the understandable regulation and that sort of stuff. That means you need to be quite bold to change it. But you do see, and I will shut up in a minute, and Andrew will answer much more clearly than I have, sometimes you see in the NHS, for a while, because it always changes, you see a trust or an organisation in community or primary care or mental health or whatever it is, which seems to be able to meet all its operational targets and all its financial targets, and where people are happy working. And that means probably, and I haven't looked at this forensically or anything, probably the operating model, including all the things that Andrew and I talked about before, is in sync with what the organisation is to do. And the obverse of that is where you see an organisation which is struggling to meet operational targets, assuming the operational targets are right for what the organisation needs to do, and financial ones, then probably it's not quite right and something needs to change. That's what I think.
Yeah, well, and clearly different parts of the NHS and different parts of a trust will have different operating approaches. We're thinking about how the organisation sets the overall framework, and then there may be particular parts of it that you need to focus on. So, and much of it works very well, but does it work as well as it could do in the current context? Well, so part of my question is, why do you think it's, now might be a time when people are considering what their operating model is? Andrew, if are there any particular reasons at the moment why you ought to be looking at your operating model if you were an NHS trust leader?
I think there is something about this time, the time frame that we're in. So we want this. We want to get beyond the post-COVID recovery era, when the NHS grew lots of issues and problems around performance and productivity. There's been lots of turnover in people running services and in leadership roles. And I think that NHS England wants to move away from recovery into delivering in the medium term. I think their the latest planning guidance were called the medium term strategy for the NHS over the next couple of years. But it's still really really challenging in terms of what organisations, providers in particular, have to do around things like performance, productivity, and quality. So it's almost as if we want to move out of COVID recovery back into sustained delivery, albeit in a much more difficult environment than before COVID. How you organise yourselves to deliver that is really important. People understanding their roles and an organisation and an organisation geared towards supporting them to deliver seems to me essential, including lots of basics like who's my boss, how does the IT work, how do corporate services support me, what's the information I've got to do my job, how do I get developed as myself and as part of a team. That all seems more fundamental now than usual. This is also a time, though, not just of recovering short-term delivery, but also medium and long-term transformation. We get to read lots of strategies for organisations that are ambitious about how they want to change how and where care is provided, but it's really difficult to connect that to change embedded within teams, a bit like John was saying around how you get adaptability into an organization. So how do you design your organization to deliver long-term change whilst also assuring the day-to-day pressures? How are you structured? How are you? What are the incentives in the organization? How do you move resource and prioritize horizontally across an organization? Those, I think, now are really important questions in all of our provider organizations. And I think also there's been a lot of churn and change in organizations as well. When with Tricordant, we did a review of the current state of operating models across the provider landscape. There are lots of organizations that have merged and been in groups and aren't confident in their operating models, or they are very old and they've had to put some temporary arrangements in that have become quite, in sticking plasters and workarounds. So I think that there's a need also for many organizations now to review and refresh and come back and do some kind of reset based upon the amount of organizational change they've been through over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm sure there are other reasons, but they all seem like good reasons to me.
Can I add to that before thereby dislodging completely the way Alastair's trying to steer the meeting? Sorry, but I think so at the moment trusts have to produce a medium-term plan within weeks. That medium plan has to deliver operational targets and has to deliver no deficit by, I think, the end of next year or the year after that. At the same time, you have to recast your strategy. Without the traditional approach, the only approach which has been possible to this day, is that thing called salami slicing, and it absolutely doesn't work anymore. So you have to think differently. There is no way in which you cannot. There is a duty to collaborate with other partners in the ICS and that kind of thing. There is the advent of digital. We haven't talked about AI and its impact. So there's sort of an opportunity to do things, and there are the 3 shifts. There's the 3 shifts within the NHS plan. So there is an imperative now for organisations. You have to think about what you're there to do and how to deliver it in the most cost-efficient and value-enhancing way possible, in a way that arguably presently hasn't been the case, because support from the centre allegedly isn't going to be there anymore. So there is no choice. But I think that then looking at the trusts I know, mostly in the south, there's quite a lot of variation around the kind of appetite, the will, because people are knackered, because the pressure has been on the NHS for so long, and the understanding perhaps of what an operating model is. It's not commonplace vocab kind of stuff as to how they go about it. But I think it is. That's why I think it's particularly important at the minute. There is strategic imperative to do something differently, and to do something differently inevitably means you need to look at your operating model, I think.
Yes, that resonates a lot. I mean, and on the whole, the organizations we're talking about as provider organizations might well have been formed by mergers, etc. But the kind of NHS trust provider organization has been around as an entity for 30 plus years. So although the construct you're working in, particularly with the advent of, as you said, John, of integrated care systems or provider collaboratives or groups, so it's how are we adjusting how we're working, because that external context has changed a bit. And then the internal changes post-COVID, digitization, the AI, I think gives those opportunities for enhancing overall performance by looking at your design. But obviously, how you do that is really important. And I think, and that's me attempting to address Max's question about how can you do this when there's so much change tends to be in the external superstructure of the NHS rather than within organisations, I think. What are some of the symptoms when you look at an organisation, or you hear about it? You've mentioned some of them about that the operating model might not quite be right. I mean, obviously, you mentioned, Andrew, merger. So clearly when you've merged and you may have, we did work recently with a trust and it was formed over the last 10 years, 12 years by merger from what was 4 separate trusts. And there were legacies of different corporate systems, different organizations. And you could see that, and the kind of need for alignment and clarity was really clear. But are there other sort of symptoms you think of, the operating model or the construct of how they're getting stuff done there isn't quite right?
So yeah, no, I definitely agree with that alignment point. When we work with organizations, but particularly further than the organization, people say, just tell, we're not aligned, or what is the plan, or what do we need to do? How are we organized? I think other symptoms can be that we work with organizations and the teams are all caught up in the day-to-day operational work. So their intention is to work short, medium, and long term, but everyone's time is taken up with the immediate term, and so they don't have time to do anything other than that. So you see tripartite operational teams, sometimes really good people with big ambition that do nothing but firefight. I think another symptom is where it's really hard to recruit people to take on these leadership roles in general management. There are organisations that can carry quite a lot of vacancies or have high turnover, say in general management and operational management roles, find it really hard to get clinicians to come forward and to take on leadership roles and get that pipeline working. I think that's a symptom of an organisation where people don't believe in an operating model, and that if they take on roles, they'll be able to make a difference. I think another symptom can be centralisation. We work with organisations where the standing orders will say all of these decisions are devolved through the organisation, but over time it's been inverted, and increasingly more and more has to come centrally, often to the executive team for a decision. So things that would have routinely been decided upon low down in the organisation when I was a chief exec now has been sucked up to be centralised, which again has a knock-on impact on the people that we've got working and leading the component parts of our providers.
And the complaints about that would be as loud from the executive team.
Yeah.
They're all coming up to, all the decisions are coming to me, they should be making, as it would from everyone else, saying the executive are sucking all the decisions up. And you're going, there's something wrong here. But
yeah. No, I agree that, and it does impact on the working and the interpersonal relationships horizontally through the organisation. And I guess all of those symptoms and others that people will be able to think of, it has an impact on the wider experience of staff working in the organisation, and it might be one of the key reasons why we are a bit stalled as a sector and industry around the staff surveys, the staff survey results that we get back around staff feeling engaged and their relationship with the organisation. I'm sure there are other symptoms, but I think those ones, they sort of like leap out at me, Alastair, based upon some experience over the last year that we've had working with some providers on their operating models.
Do you have a particular view, sitting as a NED in a large complex trust?
Well, that's not the only thing I do, as you know. I have a portfolio career, so it's great, isn't it? So, but anyway, I think I agree with what Andrew said. It's stress, friction, failure. It's something like that. People are stressed. There's friction. People are endlessly in meetings. There's a thing called discretionary effort, which is a term used in the NHS. People are at the very bottom of the well when it comes to that because they're trying to make it work, but ultimately they can't make it work because basically the organisation is not fit for purpose. So actually, you could say the target operating model is the thing that makes something fit for purpose. Quite a good shorthand, that. You need to trademark it.
Fit for purpose, yeah. Yeah, well, so thank you for that. In terms of how you go about looking at doing this work, if you're wanting to look at what's your operating model, again, like any work, there's different ways of doing it. And I suppose just before you answer that one, we had a client we worked with in the pharma and life sciences over many years, and they had a review of their operating model about 10 years ago by an external well-known consultancy. And this had kind of landed on most people in the organization. And there was still a visceral reaction when you mentioned this operating model they were working with. They were caught it was almost in the trauma of this new operating model. They didn't know what was coming and landed on them. And then they were still trying to work out, how do we work in line with this new operating model 10 years later? So to me, that was an example of how not to do an operating model redesign. So what do you think is important about how you go about doing this work? John, would you have a view on that before Andrew comes in?
So some things from me, straight off the top of my head. Firstly, be clear about the organisation you're in. What are the edges? And I saw there was a question that popped up on the chat thing. What are the edges of the thing that you're trying to define? Secondly, what is the core purpose? What is the strategy? If you don't have I wouldn't do this if you don't have a strategy. And by a strategy, I don't mean a big document with lots of headings and organizational parameters and the rest of it, which is kind of traditional, but great clarity about what success looks like and what you need to do. If you have those, the next factor I think you need to have is a coalition of the willing. And I think this is from the top of the organization. I know organizations, leadership is not defined by positions you hold, but it is the duty of the board to hold the vision. So it has to be owned at the top. And I would start there with the board or equivalent of whichever organization you're having defined it, you're trying to set out the target operating model for. And you don't need everybody. That's the thing. You need a coalition of the willing. You have enough power. You need enough power to drive it through. And because it's change, like in whichever this pharmaceutical company, you do need to have kind of the bandwidth, the oomph, the leadership, frankly, to be able to drive things through. Because changing the way things are done, the way things are done around here is hard. So you need to have, and I don't mean leadership by arrogant bastards who just tell people what to do. I mean the kind of people leadership that others follow. And then if you've got those things, then I would set about figuring out what the target operating model is. And of which the most important is the what are you going to do, which is not a big document. It's having that board or equivalent bought into success looks like this, I think, in whichever industry you're in.
Yeah, no, that's great. Andrew, some reflections about how we're going to go about doing it.
So I think building on what John said, in our experience of working with providers, I think it's important that the organisation, the leaders, the executive team are able to describe why we are doing this. What's the intent? Why do we feel we need to review our operating model now, and to be able to clearly be able to explain why we want to work on how our organisation works at this time in order to deliver the what we want to do short, medium and long term. And so there's a narrative for this organisation. It's important because in our experience, when people hear there's going to be a review of the operating model, they immediately fear the worst, that people are coming in to make cuts, people lose jobs. People immediately think about, at the moment, they think that an operating model is the structure, my job, my department. This is likely to be a negative. Whereas in practice, our experience is that it's positive for people when they engage in this. So I guess that's the second thing around the how, is that this needs to be done in a co-designed way. The approach that we've taken is having both very engaged executive sponsors, but also a design team, a diagonal slice of people in leadership roles from different professional backgrounds, from different levels in the organisation, who would work with us as a design team regularly on a weekly or fortnightly basis. They help us understand the organisation and to engage with it, but also it meets all of those maxims we know about how you get organisational change to fit. The real change happens in real work, and that the process you use to get to the future is the future you get. Those Myron's maxims I think is really important to this, because the operating model feels very personal to people. In some ways, more personal than a strategy. Strategies can feel abstract. Operating models are about me, my team, my job, and how we work. So recently in Cardiff and Vale with the Health Board, we had a big workshop that had all the executive team and this diagonal slice, our design team, together working as peers and partners around how do we develop accountability through the organization. Those people would never have worked. Those people would have never, many of them would never have worked together. And certainly people on the design team wouldn't have spent that amount of time with the exec team and found as much common ground as they did. I think those are the sorts of hows that can make it powerful and positive. Alastair.
I agree with you. So it's unusual for me to agree with Andrew, obviously, but on this occasion I agree completely. I want to add another thing about the way I go about it, which is data. Because you can design it kind of in an abstract way with people and traditional kind of bits of paper around the walls and that kind of stuff. But if you can do it in a way informed by data, and I have done it, I was thinking about it when I saw Max's question, twice in doing what you call operating models, I've used digital twins, or in two different settings. And I think if you have the data to do it, and you can create a digital twin that says, if you were to do it this way, this is what the effect would be, you can generate kind of a lot more buy-in from the teams that Andrew mentioned, as to you can get a bit of faith that if you do it this way, which is different to the way we do things now, if you redesign outpatients diagnostics, the way we do stuff around theatres, if you change the admission process in this way, if you I don't know, invest in capacity in the community, thereby divesting capacity out of the acute trust and this sort of stuff, this is what the result will be. And if you can do it that way, which is really hard to do, and sometimes quite expensive to do, aligned to all the people stuff that Andrew talked about, that's powerful, and that can work. And within that, because I saw Max Jones, and I think it must be the Max Jones that I know quite well, then AI, hi Max, then I think you can build AI nodes within the digital twin that you're talking about to say what the impact of AI as we understand it now will be, bearing in mind that in a generation's time in AI is about a year's time. In a year's time, it's going to be completely different. So you have to be super flexible. And if as part of the process, I guess, you can give the digital twin to the organization. Because it used to be you could design a target operating model once every 5 or 10 years. It's not like that anymore, I don't think. You've got to keep it live and going as much as you can. And that's a massive challenge in the NHS, given the cultural kind of challenge that I mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
But I think it is possible to do that. And there are organizations out there, health organizations in the States, for example, that do this. And in Spain, there's places where they do it.
And as you know, so our approach to the redesign process, as Andrew would say, would have lots of co-design with people. And we're actually about to spend nearly a week in Cardiff and Vale using a combination of Lego Serious Play, an organizational digital twin, and good old-fashioned Post-its and conversations to have a go at what are the ideas people have got within that system for how they could redesign. Everybody you speak to is frustrated where they are at the moment. The interesting thing about a Welsh Health Board compared to an English trust is they are both planning, commissioning and provision organisations, and they go from public health and prevention through to, in the case of Cardiff and Vale, top level tertiary services. They, for instance, provide the All Wales Genomics Centre. So people are frustrated that they're stuck in a focus around acute care and not achieving left shift and right shift. So the co-design opportunities are huge because it's not like everybody doesn't want to do it, but they know the way they work at the moment doesn't work. So lots of minds helping to co-design is one bit of it. The tool we use, and in future webinars, we will get into different aspects. We'll have some clinical leaders coming along, but we'll also have a session where we focus on the kind of AI-enabled org design. And that allows us to create a digital twin, which can look at where might you have AI agents working as part of teams. So we're designing an operating model where in the future, you might think there's a team of 10 people and 2 AI agents, and the people are freed up to do more high value adding activities. And actually that scope and that blend might change pretty rapidly, as you suggested, John. So we might get into that. We will get into that in future webinars. And Max may have a comment on that in a minute. But that's where we're trying to go. The other element we bring would be looking at good practice in other organizations. So there's a bit of an external challenge. You organize like this. Did you realize that actually organizations doing very similar remits, wanting to achieve similar things down the road, organize like that, or they organize like this? That actually sometimes helps people think, oh, maybe I could change or consider changing. So I think that's another bit of the change bit.
In doing that, do you look nationally or internationally, or how broad the kind of, because I would look at Ribera Salud in Spain, and I look at Kinzigtal in Germany, and all these other places where integrated care works, at least in theory.
Yeah. So I do think there's a combination of, so context is really always important in design processes. So organizations that share a more similar context, it's sometimes easier for people to see, oh, I can see how that works or doesn't work here. So another English NHS trust that has a similar service portfolio is going to be, but really looking internationally is really helpful. And depending on whether we're talking about a Welsh Health Board or an English NHS trust, you can learn a lot. So Kaiser Permanente, as you say, Valencia, the Basque Country, Scotland, Canterbury health system. There are lots of examples of systems that have developed differently over time. So I think it's good practice that we can learn from these things.
I agree. I was going to say Scotland, I don't know, genuine question. Scotland, they have a sort of integrated care model, don't they?
They do.
Or there may be a comparison between the Celtic fringes.
No, there are some interesting learning across Scotland, Wales and England. We're actually doing a different webinar series where we're actually asking that question about what are those differences. And what you often find is the degree of integration actually is much more about relationships and how people work together and what they're trying to do than the structure on the tin on the outside, I would say. That's a shorthand of learning thus far. Do you just, I'm going to bring folks in with any questions in a minute, but are there any kind of examples you want to share of, actually, I saw this operating model review or this redesign bring real benefits? Are there any examples you could share?
I'll go first if you like. So, leaving aside the military examples I said before, part of HMRC, which will remain nameless, dealing with not normal tax take, a different kind of tax take from the UK population, needed complete reorganisation. And then I, as a consultant, led a small team in which we kind of did the sort of things that you were talking about before, Alastair, really, and generating we didn't call it that, I didn't call it that, target operating model, which kind of transformed it. And we did it with the entire team. It's not a very big team. And which was enormously educational to me about the way this particular office of state works, but also pretty effective, I thought. And and they measured it, of course, use it in terms of their tax take, and you'll be appalled, delighted, or whatever to know that the tax take went up. I don't know whether in consequence or not, but I have very high regard for those guys. Secondly, Max and I worked on the edges of there's something called command centers, which is a digital way of running a healthcare system or a hospital. And the best way of doing that is definitely with a digital twin. And that started off at Johns Hopkins, which is one of the classic examples where I did a little bit of work, as well as Humber River and other places in the States. The point is, though, in both cases, probably in all cases, really, the leadership, it's driven by leadership. That's the thing. I mentioned the coalition of the willing. When I've seen it work before, the individual and collective leadership of the coalition of the willing has been of an order different to the everyday to make it really work. That is in all the command centers, which Max and I worked on. Well, I don't remember how many of those Max is involved in. Then the bit of GE Healthcare that I worked in, I designed the target operating model of that myself, because I was working then for a remarkable leader within GE who gave me the ability and bandwidth to do that, and that worked. And it was fantastic. It was literally an opportunity to use brain power with a limited budget to figure out what to do with a small team. And that was good. And a final example, which I've seen, which was not successful, actually, ultimately, where we did deliberately set out to build a digital twin with Prof. Terry Young, a person familiar, I think, to both of you. was the Diagnostics and Treatment Centre in London, which still rumbles on as an idea, where we had excellent leadership actually at local levels with the trust that we were working with. But what we had not done successfully when we set out, I didn't even know we had to, but no defence, was to make sure that the entirety of the system in London, the NHS and beyond, was ready for an idea like that. And so that kind of the coalition of the willing that I thought, that we had a coalition of the willing, but it wasn't big enough to do something of the scale that we felt we needed to do. But it was remarkable, the buy-in that we got from clinicians in some of those great ships of state in the NHS organisations you see in London, on the back of having a digital twin, bringing to life a way of doing things completely differently from what they've been used to doing before. That's a handful, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's great. Andrew, was there anything you wanted to share specifically about concrete examples?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't add anything. Keep going.
So, I could talk through lots of examples over the years. I suppose two recent ones that come to mind, just to go slightly differently from an NHS trust, was we worked with a GP practice that wanted to basically change its operating model from having a managing director, practice manager running the practice. They were 31,000 patients, 130 staff, to one where all the partners collectively took leadership and they each had a leadership portfolio. So we worked with them through the process of how do you design that? And then the portfolios, and then how do people step up to take that leadership role? How do the partners work with the relevant managers, and the amount of energy it released in the organization, because you suddenly had 7 partners with full feeling like, I really, really own this, and bringing that discretionary effort you mentioned earlier, John, was powerful. And it's a practice where people love to work and is, winning awards for digital transformation in primary care. So that's an example. The other one I'd mention, which comes back to that system issue you mentioned, John, I was privileged to work with the development of the integrated care system in Suffolk and North East Essex, which in classic NHS terms, it's the only integrated care system that achieved top level marks as a system, was recognised as the best performing integrated care system in the country as a system. And sadly, it's no longer going to exist because of the reorganisation of NHS integrated care boards. And I hope that the good practice from it, because there'll be a fair bit of consistency of leadership into the new arrangements, they'll carry it through. But they truly were able, and if you don't know, integrated care systems are collections convened by the Integrated Care Board, have all the NHS providers, the GPs, trusts, local authorities, voluntary community sectors, district councils, a whole army of partners together. And they weave together the operating model, created something where everybody would talk about we in SNE. And the whole, I think, was greater than the sum of the parts. Some of the individual trusts had some issues, and yet the we performed really well as a system. So you created the conditions that almost raised everybody's performance up. It's fascinating. So, and that was designing how does that system work as a system, as an integrated care system beyond any individual organization. So, I think there are lots of opportunities where you can see operating model design can really make an improvement, whether it's in individual trusts or different organizations. So, last few minutes, are there any other questions that any of the audience would like to raise? You can put it into chat, or you're welcome to put your hand up, either to ask a question or to make a comment on what you've heard from John and Andrew and myself as we've gone through. Max, did you want to make a comment, given you were referenced and asked a great question?
Yeah, and I'm going to take it in a totally different direction, actually. The thing that I was interested to listen to, I've enjoyed the session, thank you very much, was about how, with the sort of diminution of the ICBs, how are we going to do an operating model that has a citizen at the centre rather than an organisation at the centre? And I think I'm struggling at the moment to see how citizen at the centre, multi-agency pathway transformation is going to happen. And that seems to me to be at a system level, the operating model we need to redefine?
Yeah. So within England, that's an interesting question. So I think that's an interesting question for trusts. Unless you're a trust who's thinking, oh, I'd like to be an integrated healthcare organisation, one of these advanced foundation trusts who are almost taking the citizen-centric responsibility on behalf of the rest of the system and then drag and cohere people around it. That's one opportunity. The other opportunity, I think, is the development of integrated neighbourhood teams and the neighbourhood health model. If that's not citizen-centric, we're in trouble. When we go to Wales, we have a completely different statutory framework because we have a health board who is statutorily responsible for the healthcare and the population health for everyone. And I tell you, even having that statutory framing doesn't make it easy, still in the culture. But I don't, John and Andrew, do you have a reflection on Max's question?
Well, I think so. Hello, Max. Nice haircut. I think the NHS has been struggling to do this for about as long as I've been working alongside the NHS, really. And I mentioned Peter Colclough, Torbay, that kind of stuff. It was about 25 years ago, I think. So in reality, whatever the ICBs were, okay, that's changing. But when I've worked in integrated care, the factors which are necessary as if you're going to try and work along patient pathways, which is the right thing to do, you have to have a coalition of the willing, as I said before, but including along all the steps in the pathway. And you have to have shared budgets. And you need an information system that works the entire way across the patient pathway. If you don't have any one of those three, it's not going to work. So I think in the immediate thing of working in NHS trusts, as we do in our different ways, I think I would like to encourage the trust I work in and others to think in pathway terms and to figure out what needs to be true to deliver care for cohorts of patients along pathway terms, and to really attempt to work with partners in the system to make that true, because it works. When it works, it really works in the interests of patients. In the absence of that, the imperative to change on trusts, like the one I work in, is so great that you just have to change anyway in a way that delivers success for your patient, the patients that you have, the staff that you have, and for your boss, the taxpayer, all at the same time. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a fudge in a way. I'd still like it to be true. I've worked with the Integrated Care Foundation, or whatever it was called in Europe, for many, many years. But I kind of still, sadly, despite the left shift or whatever it's called, the one of the three shifts, and unless we actually get those things about we actually have budgets that we can work with really hard.
Andrew, anything to add?
I mean, I wonder whether ICBs will solve this problem around systemic work based around citizens. I think what I'm most excited about in the coming period is the focus of NHS England and the medium-term planning framework on the quality of providers, the bar that they need to set in terms of how good and strong they are as organisations, but also organisations within the system. So back to advanced foundation trusts, integrated healthcare organisations, I think that's the future. I think there's no reason why providers, people that provide services and employ all of our fantastic clinical and professional staff, why they can't, as part of their role as a provider, be all about the citizen and population health and integration. I think if we always pigeonhole providers into being about doing as they're told and meeting targets, rather than playing a more constructive, bigger role, which I think they can, and I think that the fact in the first round of foundation trusts they did, I think that was a high point for the NHS. So I think a focus now in the coming period on developing the provider role and having a higher bar and a greater expectation on what they can do, not only within their organisation, but in their communities and in their system. Because I think potentially they are where the NHS can be strongest, because it's where the professionals and the clinicians are based.
Thanks, Max, for the question. Time is up. I just want to thank again John and Andrew very much for coming along, for your contributions. And thank you everybody who's joined us today, for your questions. And again, I Hope you found it a valuable session. If you go to the Tricordant website, you will find there are a series of blogs, including by Andrew, but other colleagues on different aspects of operating models. And we'll be exploring more of these in the coming weeks on webinars. And there will be a series of podcasts too, where I'll be interviewing a number of NHS chief executives about their experiences as well in this matter. So thanks for joining, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Thank you.